We're coming to the last roundup of the workshop. This is our opportunity to hear the report outs from each of the tables. It turns out we have had 6 different tables working. We've had 2 representing publishers groups, 2 representing institutions, 1 representing researchers, and 1 representing funders. So we have 6 report outs. I'm going to ask, if it's agreeable, I'm going to start with those where we have doubles so that we can hear from both of the publishers and then both of the institutions, and then we'll move to the researchers and then to the funders, if that's agreeable. So let me begin with our publishers, and I'll just turn here to my immediate left and ask who is our rapporteur. Okay. Valde, it's all yours. You have the microphone, if you would.
Okay, so first I have to start with our tweet out, which is attributed to Leslie, who came up with this, if you want science better, make better science easier. So that's our takeaway. So what we thought was important, our first, we haven't really answered the questions, but in discussion of the questions, we kind of came up with our key points. And the first one is harmonization. So we think that developing sort of a coordinated framework across all stakeholders, journals, institutions, funders, researchers, is what can drive adoption. If we're all following similar guidelines, so there's a clear expectation of what researchers need to do, what reviewers need to review, then hopefully we can drive adoption of things like checklists, is the specific we're thinking about. But then we've heard throughout that a checklist itself doesn't do very much good. So what's key is the implementation. So across stakeholders as well, we need a well thought out implementation framework, but we need to bear in mind that this needs to be pragmatic and it needs to be inclusive. So it can't be something that works only if you're a very well-resourced journal. It has to, also work, preferably work at high throughput. I think for us, our baseline goal, though, would be transparency. We really want these checklists to at least provide transparency to editors, to authors, to reviewers, and ultimately to the public. And then we thought, because we're facing sort of large goals here, what we need to do is focus in where need has been identified. So these checklists are very long, and we're not saying that we cut the checklist. Lots of things in the checklist are essential, but already through what Nature's done, through what other checklists have done, I think sort of a need has been identified around study design and statistics. A lot of effort has been put into data accessibility, into material accessibility, into data citation, and I think we've actually made real progress there in the past few years. But what we see as a big gap is still study design and statistics. So what we would suggest is that beyond what we're doing with checklists, we should take coordinated action in those areas where we've identified highest need. And sort of a very specific suggestion there would be, we heard Shai talk about training modules, and we think that sort of training modules in these areas of study design and statistics, not targeted only at institutions and researchers, but also journals and funders. So the editors, the funding, that we all can get into sort of a common framework. And then to the end, to be a little bit more aspirational, we suggest the idea of something like a sea change for reproducibility. And if people don't see change is something that has been done at AAAS, which is what I know about it. And you may have heard more of Athena Swan, which is in the UK and has been very successful in the UK. And that's an effort where institutions basically just sort of do an inventory of where they are in terms of gender equality. And then once that inventory is done, they seek to improve and kind of get rewards like badges and things along the way for improvement. So we're just suggesting in the area of reproducibility, we could do a similar thing. That's it.
That's it. Thank you. Schwalder. Okay, I think it's Veronique, yes?
Sorry, I'm moving so that I'm not turning my back to every one of you as I'm trying to read my notes. So we had, I think, 4 points that we would like to feed back to the group. And they are very much aligned with what Valda has been describing. I think the first point is the importance of alignment and coordination to have collective action along the research process. And we've got 2 examples of that where we see that they are particularly important in terms of transparency of reporting, and how could they be better, or where they are actually examples where these workflows are working well. And the 2 examples are around data archival and the description and archival of biological material. So, but this can apply to other elements of reporting transparency as well. If you think about data archival, there is a lot that is being done around, which is essential for transparency in reporting. There's a lot that is being done. But unfortunately, these things are not always coordinated. And as publishers, we feel the difficulty being at the end of the process of having researchers who have not been prepared to store large and small data sets, even Western blots and things like that at the beginning of the process. And so we see a better workflow if actually funders set the expectations really clearly at the beginning and actually make data management plan part of a condition for funding, and really evaluate them at that stage to provide guidance early in the process. When institutions actually have a role to provide service to their researchers and guidance about data management plan, about which repository to use, and so on, and then journals can require raw data, which allows us to go back to the raw data if something happens after publication. But it's much easier for them to require that if the researchers have been prepared to do that. And so this is an example where this could work better. The second example was around biological materials, where we find it's a real important source of variability and lack of reproducibility in the studies that we look at in preclinical. And so unambiguous identification of reagents, archival of the reagents in repositories so that they're available, and authentications, for example, of some biological material is incredibly important. So it is important to have things that apply at all these stages. And, there is a good example there around authentication. Since NIH is now requiring a section in their grant application about the plans to authenticate key reagents, that is setting expectations. Some institutions have been very proactive. For example, MD Anderson Cancer Center has a policy that each cell line needs to be authenticated once a year, and they provide a core facility for researchers to do that. And that means that if journals require disclosure of that at the end of the process, it is again a no-brainer because people have done it through the process. So 2 examples there and we've actually sort of redesigned the pyramid that Brian showed, with like the need for infrastructures for sharing, important to have funding to make these infrastructure better and to have long-lasting funding for that, institutions playing an important important role in norms and in facilitating. And then at the top of the pyramid, journals and funders being aligned in their requirements so that they bookend the process with expectations that are really understood clearly. The second aspect, so the second point, was really around the importance of accountability and reward in this. And the reality is that it's very difficult to track compliance with all these things. And so we note the importance of metadata and persistent identifiers to actually have a threaded electronic signature, if you want, of a research project from a DOI for the grant, the pre-registration if it exists, or if the grant can serve as the pre-registration, a DOI for the data package, for the preprint if it exists, for the final publication, and allowing all of that to thread together so that there is a clear provenance. The third point that we noted, sort of going back to what Valda was talking about, we've noted here a tension in terms of guidelines and for transparency. There is this tension between harmonization that we feel is incredibly important to support researchers, because having 100 different checklists or guidelines is an incredible burden on researchers. But also what we've noted here in these past 2 days about the importance of less is more and emphasis in order to have compliance. And we're not quite sure how we can resolve that. We haven't got to that in the hour we discussed together, but we want to record that as a really important tension point that we should discuss. And I think that Stephen's presentation about the importance of considering this as a framework and as a social experiment is incredibly important. Checklists shouldn't be the focus of what we're talking about. And so the fourth and last point is really we need that leadership and coordination for collective action. It's very important, and we realize that in sectors we have some leadership and coordination. So publishers are pretty good at setting things like Crossref or ORCID. Funders are talking to each other. You have things like HRA, who brings together small funders. But the problem we have is actually bringing all these sectors together. And so, importance of bringing publishers to the table, funders, infrastructures are really an important component and should be here. Libraries play a really important role in gathering institutions together. And then we also need the researcher's perspective. And I think that too often researchers are not part of these discussions. And it was incredibly important for us to have points of view of researchers yesterday. And so we basically see we're very encouraged by what Marcia said this morning about the possibility of an ongoing forum for this, and we would really encourage the national academies to create that forum and to make sure that there is good diversity of researchers presented at the table as well.
Well, thank you very much, Veronique. Shall we move directly on then to our two institutional tables presentations? This time I'll start on my right. Is Franklin there? So, please.
Hi. So our table was the institution table. We broadened the question fairly quickly from checklists and reporting requirements to reproducibility generally and how institutions can promote and improve practices of researchers regarding transparency and reproducibility. It didn't really make a ton of sense to think just about checklists and requirements for us as institutions. So this is sort of structured around two broad questions. The first is, what was the sort of biggest impediments to adopting standards for transparency at universities and other research institutions? We talked a lot about metrics and requirements for tenure decisions and promotion decisions and how those need to change if we're actually going to have real change within institutions. Specifically, we had an interesting conversation sort of about whether what we think is true about how tenure and promotion are achieved at institutions is actually how it's true, or whether everyone is just going around thinking that they need to have sort of many publications in top-tier, high-impact journals. and that we need to actually know a bit more about how tenure and promotion happen at institutions, because there's a general sense that there's a lot of anxiety, and especially junior faculty feel like they need to do those things, and that drives a lot of misconduct within academic institutions, and that it's possible that that's not true, that the things that go into decisions about tenure and promotion are more diverse than impact factor and number of publications. We also talked about culture and culture needing to change at institutions, specifically a little bit about how a lot of things are seen as sorry, I'm looking for the word, as administrative burden, and that we need to reframe the idea of administrative burden as actually just being about research itself. So it's not an administrative burden to ask you to be transparent or to follow checklists or to share your data or to share your work. That's actually just properly part of science. And so that sense that that's an administrative burden that's not really part of science needs to be reframed within institutions. So we also talked about how there's this sort of black box that I talked a little bit about service and actual infrastructure, and how to make that sort of last mile connection between what we've all been talking about for the last couple of days here, which is sort of high level policy, incentives, infrastructure, and how to get that connected to the actual researchers and smaller labs who are doing a lot of the work. And that those of us who work within research support or who work within sort of the granting parts of institutions, we need, I think, better advice. We need better sort of mechanisms in order to deliver on those sort of policies and infrastructure. So then we sort of switched gears a little bit, and we talked about what we need to be doing better at institutions in order to deliver on the sort of changes and things we've talked about here for the last couple of days. I think the biggest thing we talked about was just the sense that we need to think more about community support and bringing different stakeholders together in institutions and being less siloed. We talked about sort of student-led groups, computational groups on campus that are grassroots. I think a lot of our experience has been is that those people who are driving change at research institutions aren't coming from sort of high-level offices for research or from provosts or from presidents, but they're coming from individual labs or people who are interested or research support personnel. And those are the people who are sort of creating the infrastructure on campuses in order to support other researchers. So specifically, I think we probably do need some more support from institutional leadership if this is going to get widespread adoption. There needs to be more collaboration between the sort of research compliance and audit roles within academic institutions. There probably needs to be more collaboration, generally speaking, in academic institutions. I think an observation that a number of us have had is that junior researchers are often more interested in reproducibility, in transparency, and in sharing their work openly. They're often driving change within the labs they work within. And so reaching out to them is one way of building momentum within institutions. And I think, again, we just need to reframe these reproducibility requirements so they're not seen as administrative burden, that's a mistake that they're seen that way, and that it needs to be adopted into the sort of regular culture of how science is done.
Thank you so very much. And at our other institutional table, it's Deborah.
Yeah. So, yes, I'm masquerading as an institutional person, even though I'm not one. But we had the discussion. So we also rapidly moved away from the discussion of checklists, and we decided to structure our discussion in two areas that I think have been quite prominent in the discussions overall here: culture and incentives. So we talked first of all about culture. Major point we want to make is that leadership matters. At an institutional level, cultural leadership matters. The culture that you set, it will permeate throughout your institution. We also think it's important to come at everything from the perspective that researchers are behaving honestly. Everyone is wanting to do the right thing and perform science honestly. And so we come at it from that perspective rather than directly going into punitive. We need to set up a culture where that is valued. We had a suggestion of going through with an inventory, looking at what your current research practices are, assuming that there will be a lot of variation around labs, looking at where you are in terms of data sharing, transparency, and general practices, then coming up with a set of best practices, and then agreeing on best practices, and then moving more into trying to encourage best practices, and also maybe provide disincentives for people who don't have them, for example, not letting them have graduate students if they don't meet your minimum requirements. We also talked about training of students, making sure there's a system set up for training of students in best practices right from the outset, and then also broadening that to the broader scientific community that you have. We talked about statistical advice, and this is very important. Several institutions have statistical advisors set up, but they're not used very well. In particular, they tend to be used at the end of the process, when really they should be consulted at the beginning of the process when you're doing design. And so setting that up as part of the training, that you should talk to a statistician when you're thinking about your experiment and not just when you want them to show that you have a positive result. On the flip side, we need to have a culture of openness in terms of people feeling comfortable about raising issues with the institution, having both the culture and the mechanisms in place to do that. And so institutions need to focus on that too. And then also making sure that there are consequences for people who do not conform to the standards that you're looking to set. There will be repercussions for them if they don't actually do what you want them to do. Then we moved on to incentives. It all comes kind of money. Money is important. There's not very much funding for this kind of thing, but we also recognize that if the funders start to care about this, then institutions will start to care about it too, because they care about what the funders think. So it comes back to the cooperation and everybody working on it together. We also talked about, we did talk about the tenure process, the same as the other group. We thought that we need to make sure that in the tenure process there's a clear set of criteria, making sure that there's value associated with sharing and openness and the kind of practices that we're looking to encourage. That's actually rewarded as part of the process, also teaching. When you're sending out requests for letters for tenure process, making sure that you're clear that you value this kind of thing, that you're looking for, talking about the overall contribution that someone makes to the research environment, not just the number of papers that they have. Focusing on quality of contribution, not necessarily quantity. Recognizing that team science is a valuable contribution, and while intellectual leadership is important, contributing at a team level is also important to the broader research corpus, taking that into account and recognizing it. You can set up positive incentives for good behavior. You can have awards. We talked about the Landis Award, which is for teaching. It's associated with a $100,000 prize, which for a research lab is quite a lot of money. So those positive incentives can make a big difference. You can also have performance bonuses. Institutions could set aside a certain amount of money associated with that for people who are really performing well in the kind of behaviors you're trying to encourage, and assessing them and giving them a little extra money for their lab if they're doing a really good job. We talked about PhD graduation as well, standards for PhD graduation. A lot of that tends to be focused on us having a certain number of papers. But if you could focus more on transparency, openness, contribution to the research corpus, data sets, even being honest about your negative results, as long as you've done a good job of conducting the research that you did, even if it didn't result in 5 high-profile papers, you would still get rewarded and still get your PhD. I think that probably covers it. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. Now looking to our researchers, who's going to report out? Okay, Michael.
All right. Well, so much as others, we strayed a little bit from the original definition and specifically wanted to answer the question of what actions we could take for widespread adoption of minimal standards for transparency and rigor. And so a couple of the points that we've thought of are ones that have been echoed around the group. Picking up first on this question of harmonization and minimal requirements, we had one proposal as an example of actually reporting in a standardized sort of form a logical tree of the work you do. Back in grade school, you were told to show your work, and so we should do that too, by actually going through that logical example. And so to be very concrete about this, instead of, or in addition to, a very minimal checklist, an actual web form or other dynamic form where you can report that diagram. As of right now, there are remarkably few tools for these sorts of diagrams, and that's a pain point that came up in the discussion today. But if there were a standard way to do that, that would make it very clear, highlighting what your reasoning was and what those decisions were and in review and other sources too, what the gaps were. So we'd imagine that for journals, we'd imagine that for funding agencies as being an example of requirement. An interesting point that came up parenthetically was to also include the date of some of those decisions or results in that tree. The flow of the tree and the logic might not always be chronological, and so showing the date when people made these decisions would enhance transparency. A second point is, at least so in San Francisco, there's a lot of interest in entrepreneurship. As a result, there's organizations there at our university that have a startup in a box framework, that if you want to start a company, there's boilerplate information, legal advice, and other things that you can get started with. One thing we heard about today is librarians are perfectly suited to be those on the data science side to provide lab in a box. Basic starting boilerplate ways to think about data, where data are available, to think about standardization, compliance, other information to get you started as a lab, either as an early stage investigator or later on, which is a more senior group, that you want to standardize a basic set of tools. And so an additional point that we came to was getting to this question of reproducibility and replication, specifically as an active endeavor. We mentioned already during this workshop the idea of trainees, but let's flesh that out a little bit about how they might fit into this endeavor. And so the idea is we have journal clubs. This is already an expectation in most programs. What about, as part of the didactic process, before one's qualifying exam, you are required, for instance, if you are an institution with a training grant, to put your trainees through the process where each trainee, in consultation with faculty mentors, just as they are in consultation with faculty mentors on a journal club, is committed to attempting to reproduce, or if relevant, replicate, an existing study. Now, we had some discussion around the table about the feasibility of that depending on the field and how some studies are easier or harder to reproduce, about the fact that if you're going to put this in place, then an institution, or at least the researchers involved in this, might also need to put together resources of existing studies that you could use as a default if there isn't one appropriate to your field or isn't obvious. This is a great exercise in scope, because a trainee will get feedback on appropriate scope of what can be done during the length of a single course, in mentorship, and in the specific practice of science, ideally in their field, in preparation for proposing their own science. And so, again, this is taking the idea, I think we heard about burden, and this is from Franklin, and bringing burden and changing burden into training instead, and doing that training in line with what we are trying to have our trainees learn. It was also brought up that we're completely ignoring undergrads in this. In the 6th through 12th grade, there's science fairs where people actually, if anything, report too much of their methods. And in grad school, we're expected to report this. But most fields in undergrad don't have this sort of coursework. And I'm sorry, I've shaded into the second point here, which was not on reproducibility now, but on formal coursework in experimental design. And so that's where we're ignoring undergrads. And specifically, having actual experimental design research courses is something that varies hugely across the group from at least what we've talked about here. Some institutions, some are doing a great job of this, but many are not. And most do not have it, specifically, say, in lab courses for undergrads or even in graduate. And then one additional point, though we're coming near the end of the list, was then we specifically wanted to look at some of these questions with respect to more seasoned career PIs versus early career. So for seasoned, one thing is that senior and seasoned PIs have a lot of influence. As a result, they can lead by example. And so some of the basic things that they can do to lead by example are share data, which many do not, have a culture of openness, which we heard just moments ago, within the lab itself, such that it is not solely the responsibility of a PI. Well, let me back up. It is always the responsibility of a PI to stand by their work. But if your only check on a research result is the eyes of a single human being who has many responsibilities, things will get through that shouldn't. And so if you have a culture of openness, and examples I'll come to later are things like code review, within the lab, then that's an additional check from the group itself that helps but does not replace the responsibility of a PI for the work and the data that are coming out of their group. And additionally, adopting open source tools, preprints and data repositories were some other things that senior PIs can lead by example with. Switching gears now to early stage investigators. Early stage investigators have some other strengths. One is they typically, early on, have a little more personal time that's closer to the research itself. Early stage investigators can invest in eyes-on and can actually look at more of the data than a senior investigator can with a larger lab. Additionally, it's typically the early stage investigators that are more conversant with new tools or practices. An example of a new tool or practice that they can bring in, as I referred to, was code review, where the lab itself is self-reviewing itself as part of the procedure and getting feedback. And then additionally, we've seen too that earlier stage investigators are more willing to be agile and to completely change the way their lab works without having a huge track record of not having done studies a certain way. And so there's a little more willingness to do that. And then finally now, on the early stage side, more specifically, questions about grants, because we talked about money matters. And so, of course, we all want to do as many things as we can to do science as perfectly as possible, but what can actually help, what can be directly aligned immediately with what the concerns of many investigators are, especially in the early stage, and that is more feedback, especially from foundations, on early stage grants. Because many early stage investigators these days are applying to foundations, and the feedback they get is there were many qualified applicants, more than we could possibly fund. There is no feedback on the reproducibility, the transparency, or even other basic concerns about the grant applications they put in. And yet this is perhaps one of the segments of the research population that needs this feedback the most. And so secondly, in terms of feedback, and my final point on all of this, is having formal peer review within an institution. We again found that some institutions have a formal policy. Some institutions require a grant to be submitted half a year in advance and have internal study section. And there is no way around that. That is the rule within that institution. Other institutions have nothing. And so having even some baseline degree of peer review as an expectation for grants is something, again, that specifically would benefit early stage investigators, perhaps up to mid stage as well and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, we'll turn to our funders table. And Richard, I think you have the floor.
Thank you. This will be, I hope, short. We started with the issue of checklists and guidelines, and I think the emphasis from the group was to try and see that a minimal set, somewhat harmonized across funding groups, particularly across funding groups, but harmonized so that investigators don't have to meet multiple requirements. There needs to be some local flexibility, but there should be a core set in which there's wide agreement on what that core set will be. And it would be useful to have tools that allow interoperability so that an individual investigator can relatively quickly translate what they've done from one system to another. Some prioritization of these, as has been emphasized, it's very difficult to deal with the long list of everything that we want. So prioritizing what's most important so that the culture changes in a way that PIs can follow. The focus should be on transparency, which leads to rigor. We spent the most time, I think, on culture change and how to achieve that. The role of funding agencies is important in that culture change. It has to start with training. NIH has been a little slow to come up with its training requirements in this domain. I understand it's just about to come out, and we should all cheer when that happens. It's another part of the culture change will be getting leadership involved, some of the scientific societies, funders, chairs of departments, senior scientists, champions, especially among younger scientists who we think will initiate change. In some way, this is a little bit like the problem of sexual harassment in universities, in that in order to get change, you needed to have local champions who were willing to speak up about problems and insist that change occur. And we need some of that as well here. Burden minimization was important in order to get any culture change, and tools and platforms are important for burden minimization, and so funders need to be prepared to support that development. Again, funders have to make room in their environment, just not for innovation, but replication and other kinds of things to support the system. And finally, measuring success is important. To implement change and not seeing whether or not it is useful, helpful, or actually leads to improvement is something we often skip, and to our amazement, things don't work. So we've got to have this feedback loop completed and make sure that we look for signs of change. Thanks.
Well, I want to thank all the rapporteurs, but let me ask others who have not had a chance to speak in this last session, was there any idea or concept or point that you wanted to raise especially that might not have been reflected in the summary? Does anyone want to add anything to what we've already heard? Yes, Steve.
This is just a minor gloss. It was mentioned that we should have a certain, facility and in consultation with statisticians. We also had emphasized that it's the institutional responsibility to have adequate capacity both for computational scientists and for statisticians, so that there's a realistic hope that labs and clinical investigators would actually get the help when they needed it. So the institutions have to be willing to put up that money, but in the end, they're actually all supportable by grants almost immediately. So it's capacity as well as how they're used.
Thank you for that addition. Other thoughts, additions? If not, let me just say from a vantage point on behalf of the organizers of the workshop, from my vantage point, honestly, it has exceeded my own expectations of how much we could accomplish. This really was a result of the ingenuity, I would say the genius of our staff in helping to guide and to invite the right people to participate. The depth of knowledge, the range of experience, the spectrum of innovative ideas that have been already represented in these last 2 days has been quite impressive. And I hope out of the report there will be opportunities for those of us who care about this field and this endeavor, and for the academies themselves, as well as our respective institutions, to take note and to take heart from the ideas that we have developed and that we're helping to promulgate. One can't escape the feeling that there is a movement, that word was used in the course of the discussion, there is a movement toward higher levels of rigor and transparency in science. And if we can foster that movement to a degree that accelerates beyond what it otherwise would already have achieved, I think we can count this effort as a success. I want to close just by asking us all to thank again our incredible staff. If you wouldn't all mind all rising who played a part in this to get recognized. I wasn't clear. I meant for the staff to rise, but they deserve the standing O. There's no question about that. Really, I can only wish you all Godspeed on your ways home and to continue this incredibly important work. Thank you all for being part of this workshop.